The highway had no name out here, just a number on a faded green sign that flickered past in May Rains's headlights before disappearing into the dark behind her. Wyoming in January didn't care much for names. It only cared about cold and about wind, about the kind of silence that pressed against the windows like something alive. May kept both hands on the wheel, not because the road demanded it, because holding something helped. The heater in the old Ford F-150 rattled when it worked and quit when it didn't. Right now, it was doing something in between, pushing lukewarm air across the cracked dashboard in uneven bursts. On the passenger seat, Diesel lifted his broad black and tan head, sniffed at the vent, then lowered it again onto his paws. His amber eyes stayed open, watching the road the way he always did. Patient, steady, present in a way that May had stopped being able to fake. She reached over without looking and laid her scarred right hand on his back. He didn't move, just breathed. Outside, the plains stretched flat and pale under the thin quarter moon. Snow had fallen 2 days ago and frozen hard, so the fields glittered faintly like something buried under glass. The pines along the ridgeline stood dark and close together, their shapes dissolving into the sky where the stars began. It was the kind of landscape that made a person feel very small, and May had long since decided that small was fine. Small meant invisible. Invisible meant no one was asking questions she didn't know how to answer. She had been driving since 4 in the morning. Not because she had somewhere to be, because staying still had stopped working somewhere around Cheyenne. There was a coffee cup wedged in the cup holder, cold now, the dregs long since gone bitter. She hadn't stopped for more. Stopping meant talking to someone behind a counter who might smile at her and say, "Have a nice day," and mean it, and May wasn't sure she could receive that kind of kindness right now without it going somewhere it shouldn't. 20 years in the Marine Corps, 2 deployments overseas, one of them so classified she still couldn't say the name of the place out loud in mixed company. 8 years as an explosive ordnance disposal technician, which meant she had spent the better part of a decade kneeling over devices designed to end lives and carefully, methodically removing that possibility from the world. She had been good at it, exceptional according to the commendations folded in the manila envelope in the back seat, the one she hadn't opened since her discharge date. What the commendations didn't mention was what EOD did to a person's nervous system over time. The particular way your brain rewired itself when the difference between alive and not alive came down to the steadiness of your hands and the accuracy of your read on a situation. The way that rewiring didn't go away just because you handed in your gear. The divorce had been quiet. No shouting, no accusations. Just 2 people sitting at a kitchen table in Raleigh, North Carolina, looking at each other across a distance that had nothing to do with miles and finally saying the thing that had been true for a long time. She didn't blame him. She wasn't sure she blamed herself either. Some things just got used up. What she had left was the truck, the dog, a duffel bag, a box of tools, and $917 in the glove compartment, and a printed page of directions to a property north of Rawlins that she had found on a classified site 3 days ago while sitting in a truck stop parking lot eating a gas station sandwich, Diesel asleep on the seat beside her. Cold War bunker, 18 acres, $900, sold as is. She had read it twice. Then she had read it a third time slower. She wasn't superstitious. 20 years of military service had burned most of that out of her. But there was something about those words, bunker isolated, sold as is, that reached past the rational part of her brain and spoke directly to something older. Something that said walls, quiet. No one can reach you there. She had called the number on the listing before she finished the sandwich. Now she was here. The turnoff came up faster than she expected, a dirt track cutting left off the highway with no marker, except a rusted fence post leaning at an angle that suggested it had given up caring about verticals some years ago. May slowed, checked the directions on her phone, and turned onto the track. The truck bucked over frozen ruts. Diesel steadied himself without waking, fully shifting his weight with the easy balance of a dog who had spent years in moving vehicles. The track wound between low hills for about a mile, the headlights catching sage and frozen grass, and the occasional set of deer tracks pressed into the snow. Then the trees closed in pines leaning over the path, and the track ended in a small flat clearing about 30 yards across. May stopped the truck, cut the engine, sat for a moment in the sudden silence. Diesel raised his head. She grabbed the flashlight from the door pocket and stepped out. The cold hit her like a wall, immediate, in total, the kind that got into your lungs before you had time to prepare for it. She pulled her jacket tighter and swept the flashlight across the clearing. There it was, a concrete slab roughly 10 feet square, set flush with the ground and nearly invisible under a crust of snow and dead grass. At its center, a round metal hatch with a large iron wheel, its surface mottled brown with old rust. The flashlight caught the hatch's edge and held it. May walked toward it slowly. Diesel dropped from the truck bed and moved beside her, nose working, reading the frozen air. She crouched and brushed snow off the hatch with her gloved hand. The metal underneath was solid thick, the kind of gauge you didn't see in civilian construction. Government material. Cold War era, which meant the early 1960s, which meant built to withstand things that no longer seemed possible and had never quite stopped seeming possible, either, depending on who you asked. She pressed her palm flat against it. Even through the glove, she could feel the cold radiating upward, the deep chill of something that had been sealed for decades, holding its temperature like a secret. Diesel pressed his muzzle against the edge of the hatch and inhaled. Then he sat back and looked at her. "Yeah," May said quietly. "I know." She didn't try to open it that night. The keys were with the paperwork, which was in Rawlins, which meant morning. She went back to the truck, pulled a sleeping bag from behind the seat, reclined as far as the cab allowed, and lay with Diesel's warmth against her side, staring at the ceiling. She didn't sleep for a long time, but for the first time in months, she wasn't running from anything inside her head. She was just waiting. That was different enough to matter. The office of the Carbon County Property Recorder was a single room on the second floor of a building that smelled of old carpet and radiator heat. Donna Hale sat behind the counter in a gray wool blazer, her dark hair pulled back, her reading glasses halfway down her nose. She was early 40s, precise in the way of someone who had spent years cleaning up other people's paperwork, and she looked at May with the careful attention of a woman who noticed things but didn't always say them. May slid the printout across the counter. The listing, her ID. Donna glanced at both, then at May, then back at the listing. She pulled out a manila folder from a drawer and began checking numbers. $900, she said. Cash. May set the bills on the counter. Donna counted them, clipped them together, and began filling out the transfer document in a slow, methodical hand. The only sound in the room was her pen and the radiator ticking. Then, without looking up, she said, "Last person who lived out there was a man named Edgar Voss, engineer, government contractor, from what the old records say. He moved onto the property in the early 60s, maintained it himself." May waited. Donna's pen kept moving. Disappeared in 1965. Sheriff at the time filed a missing persons report. Closed it after 6 months. Never found a body. She paused just briefly. Never found a reason he'd have left either. She finished the form, slowed it across with the keys. 2 keys on a plain steel ring. Old heavy, the kind cut by hand. "The property is yours, Miss Raines," Donna said. May pocketed the keys. "Anything else I should know?" Donna looked at her for a moment over the top of her glasses. She seemed to be deciding something. "Just be careful down there," she said. "Structure's old but sound, and the land around it tends to be quiet." She paused. "Tends to stay that way." May nodded once and walked out. She didn't ask what Donna meant by that. She had learned a long time ago that when people added a pause before the last thing they said, the pause was usually the real sentence. Back at the property, May worked through the afternoon. The first key opened the hatch lock. The wheel turned stiffly, decades of rust fighting the motion, but May had patience for stuck things. She applied steady pressure, even unhurried, and eventually the wheel gave grinding metal against metal in a way that sent Diesel back 2 steps. The hatch lifted with a long, pressurized exhale, like the property itself had been holding its breath. Cold, stale air rose from below, carrying the smell of rust concrete, old machine oil, and something faintly sweet underneath it all that May identified after a moment as paper. A lot of paper, aged and dry. She aimed her flashlight down the shaft. A ladder descended about 15 feet to a steel door. The rungs looked intact. She tested the first one with her weight. It held. She went down. The steel door at the bottom opened with the second key swinging inward on hinges that protested but held. May stepped through and swept the flashlight around the space. The main chamber was maybe 20 feet across, low-ceiling concrete on every surface. Metal shelving ran along 2 walls stacked with boxes labeled in military stencil print. Rations, first aid, tools, chemical supplies, all of it coated in fine gray dust, undisturbed. In the far corner, a generator sat beside a fuel tank. May checked the gauge, half full. She primed it the way she'd learned in the field. 3 firm pumps, choke adjusted, and pulled the cord. The generator coughed twice and caught throwing yellow light across the room. The bulbs overhead were old incandescent fixtures, the kind that took a moment to warm to full brightness. In that warming light, May stood in the center of the room and looked at what she'd bought. It was cold, dusty, old, and completely silent. It was the first space she had stood in longer than she could clearly remember, where she felt her shoulders drop. Diesel padded in behind her, his claws clicking on the concrete. He moved through the room in careful circles, nose working every corner, then came back to May and sat at her feet. He didn't growl, didn't alert, just sat. Clear, May said quietly, the old EOD habit of speaking the assessment out loud even when there was no team to hear it. She set up the cot she'd brought from the truck, positioned it near the generator for warmth. She ate cold beans from a can, shared half with Diesel, and lay back with her jacket still on. The generator hummed steadily. The light steadied. Outside, the wind was beginning to rise, pressing against the vents in the ceiling with a low, irregular moan. She reached into her jacket pocket and pulled out a small object. A military ID tag, not hers. The chain was gone, the metal worn smooth from years of handling, but the name was still legible if you knew what you were looking for. Thomas J. Riggs, Staff Sergeant, USMC. Tommy had handed it to her the morning of the mission that killed him. Just put it in her hand and said, "Hold on to this for me," and grinned the way he always grinned, like nothing in the world could actually touch him. She had believed it too, right up until the moment she didn't. She rubbed her thumb across the surface of the tag. The edges dug into the old scar tissue on her palm. "We made it, Tommy," she said to the ceiling. Not the way either of us expected. The generator hummed. The light held. She was asleep within 5 minutes, which was the longest run of peace she'd had in years. The second night was when it started. May woke sometime after midnight to Diesel standing rigid beside the cot, every muscle in his body locked, his gaze fixed on the far wall near the generator. Not the door, not the hatch above, the wall. She was awake in an instant, the full wakefulness of someone whose nervous system had been trained not to waste time on the gradual. Her hand found the flashlight before her eyes fully adjusted. Diesel wasn't growling. He was doing something quieter than that, a sustained vibration in his chest, barely audible, the kind of signal he gave when something was wrong but not immediately dangerous. Present but not urgent, real but not now. Mayrose slowly moved beside him and followed his gaze. The wall was concrete like all the others. Shelving along part of it, the generator in the corner, pipes running along the ceiling. Nothing unusual, nothing visible. She stepped forward and placed her palm flat against the surface. Cold. She moved her hand a foot to the left and tapped with her knuckles. A dull thud, dense and dead. She moved another foot and tapped again. The sound changed, not by much, not dramatically, but to an EOD technician who had spent 8 years listening for the difference between what a surface should sound like, and what it actually sounded like, the change was unmistakable. Hollow. May tapped again in a slow grid, the way she would have worked a suspect device mapping the cavity by sound. The hollow section was roughly 3 feet square, centered about 4 feet up from the floor. Not accidental, not a void in the pour, deliberate. Someone had built a space behind this wall and then covered it over. Diesel stepped forward and pressed his nose against the concrete. His tail had gone stiff. He looked up at her once, then back at the wall. May straightened and stood in the humming yellow light, looking at the wall for a long moment. Easy, she said, not to the dog, to herself. She had learned long ago that the worst thing you could do when you found something unexpected was rush it. Rushing was how people died. You slowed down. You mapped what you knew. You built a picture. Then you acted. She went back to the cot, but she didn't sleep again. She sat with her back against the wall, Diesel beside her, and watched the far concrete until the generator's warmth and the slow rhythm of the dog's breathing eventually pulled her eyes shut. The storage shelves yielded more than she expected the next morning. Behind the rations boxes and the first aid kits and a rusted hand pump, she couldn't immediately identify. She found a metal box wedged sideways behind a water drum. Inside the box, beneath a folded American flag, sealed in brittle plastic and a set of signal flares that had long since lost their reliability, was a leather notebook. Dark brown its surface, cracked and dry, the leather pulling away from the binding at one corner. On the front, in faded gold, stamping a name. Edgar Voss. May carried it to the metal table, sat down and opened it. The first pages were technical, tight, precise handwriting, the kind engineers made small and even and dense. Construction notes, load-bearing specifications, ventilation calculations. Dates that started in early 1961. Edgar Voss had documented the building of this facility in meticulous detail, every pour of concrete, every weld, every mechanical system. She read slowly. The EOD, part of her brain, the part that parsed technical documents, the way other people parse novels, moved through the specifications and built a picture of the structure around her. The bunker was more sophisticated than it looked. Double walls in the main chamber, a secondary drainage system that didn't appear on the surface layout, and a lower level referenced once in an early entry and then not again in language careful enough to suggest deliberate omission. Secondary containment, Edgar had written in March of 1961. Below grade, sealed per directive. I have been asked not to document this further. May read that twice. She kept turning pages. As the months passed and the entries, the tone shifted. The precision remained, but something underneath it changed. References to visits, men arriving at night, shipments with no manifests. In October of 1963, Edgar wrote a single sentence that stood apart from the rest. They told me what this place is really for. I wish they hadn't. He didn't elaborate, just moved on to the next technical notation as if the sentence hadn't happened. By 1964, the entries had grown shorter, more erratic, words crossed out and rewritten. In February of that year, he wrote, I hear it sometimes at night, a sound through the floor, low and steady like something breathing under the concrete. I know what it is. I put it there. But knowing doesn't make it easier to hear. May sat back, the generator hummed. Diesel lay at her feet watching her. She turned to the last pages. Most of the final section was damaged, the ink faded or water-stained, the pages stuck together at the corners from old moisture. She separated them carefully the way she would have handled delicate circuitry and read what remained. The last entry in Edgar's handwriting was dated June of 1965. 5 words, I'm not going to stay. Below it on the same page in different handwriting, written in different ink, with the uneven pressure of someone writing quickly and not with a steady surface, were 2 more lines. Edgar wasn't crazy. Don't trust anyone in a suit. No name, no date. The ink looked newer than Edgar's, though in a space this dry and cold newer could mean anything within a 50-year range. May stared at those two lines for a long time. The warning wasn't addressed to anyone, but it was written to someone. Someone the writer had expected, or at least hoped, would eventually find this place. Someone who would open this notebook and read far enough to reach the end. Someone like her. She closed the notebook, set it flat on the table, pressed both palms against it for a moment, the old habit of physical contact to confirm a thing was real. Diesel got up from the floor, walked to the far wall, and sat in front of it, looking at the concrete, tail still. May watched him. Then she got up, went to the shelves, and began looking for a map. She found it folded inside the back cover of an old maintenance manual, a hand-drawn layout of the facility on yellowed grid paper, the kind sold in engineering supply stores. The main chamber was labeled, the storage area, the utility corridor, and near the generator, a small square marked with the notation 3A and a dotted line indicating a seam in the wall. She went to the generator, ran her fingers along the metal paneling behind it. Most of it was flat and flush. But in the lower left corner, near the floor, one panel sat fractionally proud of the others. Not much. The difference was less than a millimeter. She would not have noticed it without the map, and she would not have noticed it with the map if she hadn't spent years training her hands to read surfaces the way other people read text. She knelt, ran the edge of her multi-tool along the seam. It caught in a gap, slight but real. She applied pressure slow and lateral, the way you applied pressure to something you weren't sure about, ready to stop. The panel gave with a sound like an exhale. A metallic creak, brief and reluctant, and then it swung inward on a hinge at the top, revealing a gap in the wall about 18 inches wide and 2 feet tall. Cold air came out, colder than the room, carrying that metallic sweetness she'd noticed when she first opened the hatch, stronger and now more distinct. Below the sweetness was something else. Earth, stone, the particular smell of a space that had been sealed long enough to develop its own atmosphere. She angled the flashlight through the gap. A shaft dropped straight down, about 8 inches wider than her shoulders on each side. A ladder mounted to the near wall, the rung steel rod bolted into the concrete at regular intervals. She counted what she could see before the light was absorbed by the dark below. At least 15 feet, possibly more. She sat back on her heels and looked at the shaft for a long time. Diesel came and pressed his shoulder against her leg. She thought about Edgar Voss, who had built this space and then stopped talking about it in 1963, who had written, "I'm not going to stay 2 years later," and then disappeared into the Wyoming winter without leaving an explanation anyone could find. She thought about the words in someone else's handwriting. Don't trust anyone in a suit. She thought about Donna Hale's pause before the last thing she said, the pause that was the real sentence. May had spent 8 years going toward things that other people ran from. She had done it not because she was fearless, but because she understood that the fear was information, not instruction. Fear told you to pay attention. It didn't tell you to stop. She pulled the rope from her kit bag, anchored it to the shelf frame, and tested it twice. Then she told Diesel to stay, took the flashlight in her left hand, and went down. The shaft was tighter than it looked from above. The walls were close enough that she could feel them on both sides. The ladder held. She counted the rungs as she descended. 14, 15, 16. Her boots touched concrete. She turned around. The beam of the flashlight swept a small chamber roughly 20 feet across with a ceiling so low she had to angle her head slightly. The walls were cleaner than the room above, the concrete finer grained, poured with more care. In the center of the far wall stood a door unlike anything else in the facility. Round, steel. The diameter of a standard vault door, its surface covered in old rust, but its structure intact, the kind of mass and construction you saw in bank vaults and nuclear-era containment facilities. A dial was set into the face, the numbers worn, but legible, and beside the dial, etched into the steel, with what looked like a hand tool, a date, July 18th, 1963. May recognized the date immediately. It matched the entry in Edgar's notebook exactly. The one where he had written, "They told me what this place is really for. I wish they hadn't." A man who sealed a vault on a specific date and then etched that same date into the door was leaving a message. The date was not a memorial. It was a combination. She stood in front of the door and put her hand on the dial. The metal was shockingly cold even through her gloves. She turned it slowly, working through the sequence the way she worked everything in the field, no force beyond what was necessary, each movement deliberate. 7, 18, 63. On the third number, something in the mechanism shifted, a sound like a deep internal metal releasing metal, then a solid resonant clunk that she felt as much as heard traveling up through her boots and into her bones. The door opened. It moved inward slowly, its own weight carrying at the hinges, screaming with the sound of a thing that had not moved in 60 years. The air that came out was different from the shaft above. Drier, stiller, the smell of metal and wax paper and something she could not immediately name, something with a weight to it, a density that had no business belonging to air. She stepped through the doorway. The flashlight beam moved across rows of wooden crates, stacked 4 high against every wall, each one stenciled in black print. U.S. Treasury, federal property, do not open. The stenciling was crisp, the wood beneath it dry and intact. The crates were uniform in size, about the dimensions of a large suitcase, and there were many of them. She went to the nearest crate and found the seam with her multi-tool. The wood split cleanly dry as kindling. Inside, wrapped in wax paper that crumbled at the edges when she touched it, were bars of metal stacked in tight rows. She lifted one. The weight was immediate and specific. The particular weight of something with no air in it, no hollow space, no compromise. Dense all the way through. She turned it in the beam of the flashlight. The surface was dull with age, slightly filmed, but the color beneath was unmistakable. A warm, low-luster gold that did not change when she tilted it, that had no variation based on angle, that was the same from every direction. She stood with the bar in her hands for a long time. Then she knelt slowly until she was sitting on the cold concrete floor, her back against the nearest stack of crates, the gold bar resting across her open palms. The flashlight lay beside her, aimed at the ceiling, throwing diffuse light across the vault in all directions. From above, faint but clear, she heard Diesel bark once. Sharp, short. The sound of a dog checking on someone who had been gone too long. She exhaled slowly, the breath leaving her like something she had been carrying without knowing it. Not relief exactly, not triumph, something older than both of those. The particular stillness of a person who has been walking a long time and has finally found the place they were walking toward, even if they never knew that's what they were looking for. She put the bar back in the crate, closed the lid as best she could, and stood. Before climbing back out, she swept the flashlight one more time across the vault. The beam caught the far corner where the crate rows ended, and something else began. A military-issue document, safe steel, sitting flush against the wall behind the last row. She almost missed it. She filed its location away precisely. She went back to the ladder and climbed. When she came up through the panel into the yellow light of the main chamber, Diesel was right there, and he pressed the full length of his body against her legs before she was fully upright, the way he did when he had decided she had been somewhere he couldn't follow for too long. She sat on the floor and put both arms around him. He was warm and present and real in a way that nothing else in the last 12 hours had been. "Yeah," she said into his fur, "we found it." The generator hummed, the lights held steady. Outside, the wind had dropped and the Wyoming hills were quiet, in the way they went quiet when the cold got serious, when the temperature fell past a certain point and even the air stopped moving. May sat on the floor of a Cold War bunker with a German shepherd in her arms and more gold beneath her feet than she could calculate, and she knew with the clear, practical certainty of someone who had spent 2 decades reading dangerous situations that what she had just found was not going to stay found by only her for long. She reached into her jacket and closed her hand around Tommy's dog tag. Held on. 3 days passed without incident. May used them well. She drove into Rawlins twice for supplies. Fuel for the generator, canned food, a better sleeping bag rated to -20, a box of heavy-duty bolts she used to reinforce the hatch from the inside. She covered the panel behind the generator with her toolbox, stacking it flush against the wall with the deliberate casualness of someone who had learned that the best concealment was the kind that didn't look like concealment at all. She read Edgar's notebook twice more cover to cover, taking notes in the margins of a legal pad she'd found in the truck. The technical entries told her things the hand-drawn map hadn't. The lower vault had its own ventilation system separate from the main chamber, running through a secondary pipe buried deep enough in the hillside to be invisible from the surface. The drainage was engineered to redirect groundwater away from the vault walls. Whoever had designed the lower level had designed it to last, not decades, longer. She thought about that word Edgar had used, safeguard. At night, she lay on the cot and listened to the Wyoming dark and tried not to think too hard about what was directly below her feet. It was easier than she expected, not because the goal didn't matter, but because May had a talent trained and practiced for setting aside the things she couldn't act on yet. You did not think about the device while you were still getting into position. You thought about your next step, only your next step. Diesel slept beside the cot, woke when she woke, ate when she fed him. On the second evening, he padded back to the generator wall, sat in front of it for a while, and then returned to her without being called, as if confirming that it was still there and still sealed, and that his report stood. Good dog, May said. On the fourth morning, she heard tires on the frozen track above. She cut the generator in one practice motion and stood in the sudden silence. Diesel was already up facing the hatch, his ears angled forward in the position that meant something. Outside requires assessment. May climbed the ladder and eased the hatch open 2 inches. The sky was white and low, the kind of sky that meant more snow before evening. A black SUV was parked at the edge of the clearing, clean enough to suggest it had not come far on the dirt road or had been washed very recently. No front license plate. That detail registered first. A man stood beside it looking at the clearing. He was tall, early 50s, a long black wool coat, well cut, the kind that cost more than May's truck payment had been back when she still had truck payments. Dark suit beneath it. Silver at his temples, and nowhere else the kind of silver that looked maintained rather than earned. His shoes were polished to a mirror finish, despite the frozen mud he was standing on, which told her either he'd changed them before getting out of the car, or he'd been carried here, neither of which was reassuring. He was not looking at the hatch yet. He was looking at the tire tracks from May's truck, following them with his eyes to where the truck was parked beneath the restraints at the clearing's edge. Diesel made no sound, but the hair along his spine had risen. May eased the hatch back down and waited. 30 seconds later, a knock. 3 measured raps on the steel evenly spaced. Patient. The knock of someone who had knocked on doors before and understood that patience communicated something that urgency didn't. May opened the hatch and climbed out. The man watched her emerge with an expression that gave away nothing. Up close, he was sharper than he'd looked from a distance, his face lean and angular, his eyes a pale gray that assessed her in the half-second between her clearing the hatch and straightening to her full height. He smiled. The smile reached exactly as far as it needed to and no further. "Ms. Raines," he said. His voice was smooth and even with a faint coloring that might have been East Coast private school or might have been something learned rather than born into. "My name is Marcus Holt. I'm with the Federal Historical Archive." He reached into his coat and produced a leather credential folder embossed with a federal seal. He held it open at the precise angle and distance that made it readable without making it graspable. A practice motion. May looked at it. The seal looked correct. The ID card inside had his photo, his name, a federal agency identifier. It looked exactly as official as it needed to. "What can I do for you?" she said. Not a question. Holt's smile adjusted slightly, recalibrating to her tone. We've been working to catalog several Cold War-era properties across the Intermountain West, he said, part of an ongoing historical preservation initiative. This property, the old Voss site, was flagged as one of several facilities built under a classified infrastructure program in the early 1960s. He paused as if giving her time to be interested. We're primarily looking for documents, technical records, communications, anything that might have been left on site. That sort of material has significant historical value. He kept his eyes on her face when he said that sort of material. Diesel had come up through the hatch behind her and was now standing at her left side, his shoulder against her knee. He had not made a sound since the man arrived. That particular silence was its own kind of communication. Didn't find much, May said. Old cans, dust. Holt tilted his head. The smile held. No sealed containers. No personal effects. Documents. Just what I said. He looked at her for a moment longer than was comfortable and shorter than was confrontational. Then he reached into his coat pocket and produced a business card. Plain white stock. No logo, no agency name. Just a phone number in plain black type-centered. If anything does turn up, he said, please reach out. Some of what may be in these older facilities could be considered federal property, regardless of the current land ownership. And some of it, he added almost gently, could be hazardous. Best handled by people who know what they're dealing with. May took the card. She looked at it once, then looked back at him. Holt glanced down at Diesel. Fine animal, he said. German Shepherd May said nothing. He nodded as if she had answered. Well, I appreciate your time, Ms. Raines. Enjoy the peace out here. It's a rare thing. He turned and walked back to the SUV with the unhurried pace of a man who had gotten what he came for, though. What he had come for and what he'd said he came for were May was already certain two entirely different things. She watched the SUV until it cleared the tree line and the sound of its engine faded into the distance. Then she looked down at Diesel. He was watching the point where the SUV had disappeared. He knew, May said quietly. She went back down into the bunker, turned the generator back on, and sat at the metal table with the business card in front of her. No logo, no agency name. Federal Historical Archive was not an agency she recognized, but it was plausible enough that absence of recognition meant nothing. She turned the card over, blank on the back. She held it under the work light and angled it. Nothing. Then she remembered a technique from a field intelligence module she'd sat through in 2009, mostly irrelevant to EOD work, but filed away the way she filed everything away. She found a pencil in her kit bag, held the card flat on the table, and rubbed the pencil lead across the back in long lateral strokes. Letters appeared in the unindented spaces. 4 words arranged in 2 lines pressed into the card from above, as if someone had written on a page placed over it. It's not over. May sat very still. This was not a phone number someone had jotted down and left an impression of by accident. This was a message placed deliberately pressed into a card that would be handed to whoever answered when Marcus Holt knocked on the door of this property. The card had been prepared in advance. The message had been prepared in advance. Holt had not come to investigate. He had come to assess, to see if the person who now owned this land knew what was below it. The visit had not been a question. It had been an opening move. May looked at the card for another long moment. Then she put it in her pocket and stood up. She needed to talk to someone who knew this county. Frank Tully's station was a mile off the main highway, a low cinder block building with 2 pumps out front and a hand-lettered sign in the window that said, "Open, come in, no credit." The inside smelled of motor oil, burned coffee, and the particular warmth of an electric space heater working harder than it was designed to. Shelves of oil and antifreeze ran along one wall. A gun rack behind the counter held a lever-action rifle with the casual visibility of a thing that had always been there and would always be there. Tully himself was behind the counter on a stool reading a paperback with a cracked spine. He was a big man, late 60s, with a gray beard, grown long enough to suggest he'd stopped arguing with it years ago. His hands resting on the counter were the hands of someone who had used them their whole life. Oil permanently in the creases. A scar along the left thumb from something mechanical and long ago. He looked up when May came in. Took her in the way people in small Wyoming towns took in newcomers, not unfriendly, but thorough. "You're the one bought the Voss land," he said. It wasn't a question. May had not told him that. Word traveled faster in places like this than in cities precisely because there was less noise to travel through. "That's right," she said. He nodded toward the coffee pot on the back counter. "Help yourself." She poured 2 cups without asking and brought one to the counter. He accepted it without comment, which she took as a good sign. "A man came to see me today," she said. "Tall, black coat, drives a black SUV with no front plate." Tully set his cup down, called himself Marcus Holt, she continued. Said he was with something called the Federal Historical Archive. Tully was quiet for a moment. Not the quiet of a man thinking, the quiet of a man deciding how much to say. "He came through here last spring," Tully said. "Different name, something with a K. He was asking about the Voss property. Wanted to know if anyone had been out there. Wanted to know if I knew what was in the bunker." "What did you tell him?" "Nothing to tell," Tully said. "Nobody had been out there in decades." He looked at her steadily. "He came back 3 more times over 2 weeks. Different questions, same subject. He wanted to know who had the title, whether it could be transferred privately without county records." May turned her coffee cup in her hands. "He have any ID when he came in here?" "Nothing I could verify." Tully leaned forward slightly. "I've lived in this county my whole life. I know what federal employees look like. They drive American sedans, and they wear name tags, and they apologize twice before they ask you anything." He shook his head. That man was patient in the way of someone waiting on something they already know is coming. Not investigating, waiting. He picked his coffee back up. "What's down there?" he asked. May looked at him. "I'm still figuring that out." Tully nodded once slowly. "Watch yourself," he said. "Whatever he wants in that bunker, he's been wanting it for a while. Men like that don't give up and go home. They just change the angle." May drove back to the property through the beginning of a new snowfall, the flakes coming down fine and straight in the windless cold. She sat in the truck for a while before going back below, thinking about angles. She had been asleep for perhaps 2 hours when Diesel woke her. He did not bark. He was standing rigid beside the cot in the near dark, the generator having dropped to its overnight idle, the lights dimmed to a dull amber. His attention was aimed upward toward the hatch. May was on her feet without thinking. She killed the remaining light with one motion and stood still in the complete dark, listening. For a moment, nothing. Just the generator's low hum and the muffled distance of the wind. Then a sound. Metal on metal, careful but not careful enough. The particular sound of a tool being applied to a locking mechanism by someone who knew what they were doing but was working against time. Someone was on the hatch. May reached for the rifle she had propped against the wall, within arm's reach of the cot since the second day. She found it without a light, her hand going to exactly the right place, the way a hand went to things it had practiced reaching for. She also picked up the smoke canister from her kit bag, one of 3 she'd kept from her discharge kit, the kind used in field exercises to obscure position. She moved to the base of the ladder and waited. The sound above continued, steady, focused. More than one person she assessed from the variations in pressure and timing. 2, possibly 3. Working the hatch lock with something serious, not a crowbar improvised from desperation, but the right tool for this specific type of mechanism. These were not kids from town. A harder impact. The hatch groaned bolt straining against the reinforcement May had added. It bought her 30 seconds, maybe 40. She pulled the pin on the smoke canister and rolled it into the corner of the room away from the ladder. White vapor began to spread in the dark. She climbed halfway up the ladder, flashlight in her left-hand, rifle slung across her back. She heard voices now, just barely two men low, and clipped the language of people who communicated in fragments, because they'd practiced the full version enough times that fragments were sufficient. Get it open. Now the bolts gave. The hatch screamed on its hinges and swung wide. Cold air and a blade of flashlight beam cut through the smoke. A man in a dark ski mask leaned over the opening flashlight in one hand, the other reaching for the ladder. May's light hit him from below, directly in the face, 200 lumens at close range. He recoiled, cursing hand going to his eyes. Back off, May said. Her voice came out, flat and certain. Not loud. It didn't need to be loud. The man recovered faster than she expected and shoved forward. A second figure appeared beside him. Diesel came up the ladder past May in a single fluid motion, all 90 pounds of him launching through the opening before the first man could adjust. There was a moment of impact, and then a sound that was short and raw and ended very quickly. May fired once into the air above the hatch. The sound in the confined space was enormous, a pressure wave that she felt in her chest and knew the men above felt in theirs. The next round goes somewhere useful, she said, shuffling above. Rapid breathing. A third voice further back speaking low and urgent into what sounded like a radio. She heard Diesel release. He came back down to her side, his breathing elevated but controlled. A long moment of stillness. Then retreating footsteps fast now, the discipline of the approach evaporating in the face of something that had not been in their assessment of the situation. The sound of 2 or 3 men moving quickly back through the frozen clearing. May climbed out through the hatch into the night air rifle up scanning. The clearing was empty. She could hear an engine starting in the distance back toward the main road, the sound rising quickly and then diminishing as it moved away. She swept the tree line once in both directions. Nothing moved. Diesel sat beside her in the snow, his breath fogging in the cold air. His muzzle had a dark streak across it that the moonlight made anonymous. Good boy, she said. The sound of a second engine different from the first, growing louder from the direction of the highway. Red and blue light began strobing through the trees before the vehicle reached the clearing, painting the pine trunks in alternating color. A Carbon County Sheriff's cruiser came up the track and stopped at the clearing's edge. Walt Brody got out with his hand on his holster, scanning the clearing before he saw May. He was a stocky man, late 50s, with a gray beard kept close and eyes that carried the particular alertness of someone who had been doing this work long enough to be calm about things that warranted being alarmed about. His jacket bore the county sheriff's patch worn at the edges from years rather than decoration. He took in May, the rifle, the dog, the open hatch, and the fresh boot prints in the snow with the sequential attention of a man building a picture from its parts. Ms. Raines, he said. Sheriff, she said. He walked slowly to the hatch and looked at the torn lock hardware, then at the boot prints leading back to the road. He crouched and studied the prints for a moment, pulled out his phone and photographed them. How many, he asked. 3, she said. Possibly 4. They had the right tools for the lock. This wasn't improvised. He stood. He looked at Diesel, who looked back at him with steady amber eyes. Dog do that? He asked, nodding at Diesel's muzzle. May said nothing. Brody almost smiled. He pulled out a notepad. You want to tell me what they were after? May looked at him for a long moment. Brody had served. She knew that from Donna Hale mentioning it in the property office Desert Storm, a detail she had filed and not forgotten. He was here at 2 in the morning because someone, May, or her truck, or her presence in this county had already caught his attention enough that he'd been paying attention. That was either good instinct or prior knowledge. And in her experience, those two things were not mutually exclusive in a small county with a long memory. I think they wanted to search the property, she said carefully, for what I don't know yet. Brody wrote something on his notepad. Then he looked up at her with the direct gaze of a man who had decided to be straight with someone, because it was more efficient than the alternative. There was a man in county last spring, he said, asking about this property. I ran his plates. Came back to a holding company registered in Delaware which is what a shell company looks like when it's trying not to look like a shell company. He asked me about the title history on this land, and I told him to file a records request like everyone else, Holt May said. Brody's expression shifted slightly. You've met him. He came by yesterday morning. Brody was quiet for a moment. He capped his pen and put it back in his jacket. Then he looked at the hatch again, then back at her. Whatever's in that bunker, he said it's been attracting attention long before you bought it. I've been watching this property on and off for 2 years because things near it had a way of not adding up. He paused. I'm not asking you to tell me everything, but I am telling you that you're going to need to decide soon what you're going to do with what you found. Because keeping it quiet stops being an option about the time 3 men with the right tools show up at 2 in the morning. May looked at the clearing, at the boot prints, at the broken lock on the hatch. She thought about Edgar's notebook, about the warning in someone else's hand, about the business card and the 4 words that had appeared under the pencil. I know, she said. Brody filed the report as a breaking and entering. He photographed the lock damage, collected what evidence the snow had not already absorbed, and spoke briefly into his radio before telling her he'd have a deputy run the track road twice a night for the next week. Before he left, he stopped at his car door and looked back at her. You sleep any? He asked. Some, she said. He nodded. Sleep's important. He got in. Then he rolled the window down. And get a better bolt for that hatch. Whatever you've got down there deserves better than what they just walked through. He drove back down the track and his lights disappeared between the trees. May stood in the cleared night air, the snow fine and cold against her face, and listened to the silence settle back in around the property. She was still standing there when she heard another vehicle coming up the track. Different from Brody's lighter, a smaller engine. She turned to face the tree line with the rifle still in her hands. A white pickup truck came into the clearing and stopped. The woman who got out was early 40s with ash blonde hair, pulled back in a practical braid, and the kind of face that had worked through something significant and come out the other side composed rather than unmarked. She wore a heavy wool coat and boots built for function. Her eyes scanning the clearing with a directness that matched her posture found May and held. She did not look frightened. She looked like a person who had been preparing for something for a long time and had finally arrived at it. You're May Raines, she said. May kept the rifle across her forearm. I am. Who are you? The woman crossed the clearing without hurrying, her breath fogging in the cold. She stopped at a reasonable distance, close enough to talk, far enough to have made a choice about. My name is Nora Voss, she said. Edgar Voss was my great-uncle. May's grip on the rifle did not change, but something behind her eyes did. Nora reached into her coat and drew out an envelope. Not new. The paper was the color of old cream and edges worn soft from years of handling, the seal on the back long since dried to brittleness. She held it out. My family has used a lawyer in Casper for 3 generations, she said. In 1963, Edgar gave that lawyer a sealed envelope in specific instructions. The instructions said, if and when this property changes ownership, find the new owner and deliver this in person. Edgar wrote those instructions 2 years before he disappeared. He knew even then that he wasn't going to be able to stay. May looked at the envelope. She did not take it yet. The lawyer retired in 1988, Nora continued. His son took over the practice. Then his daughter. She's the one who called me last week when the county filed the transfer. She said it was time. How did you find me here tonight? May asked. I drove out this afternoon and parked down the road, Nora said simply. I wasn't sure how to introduce myself. Then I saw the lights in the trees when the police came, and I decided waiting wasn't serving anyone. May looked at her for a long moment, at her hands which were still not nervous, at her eyes which were shot in the way of someone who had been sad about the same thing for a very long time. She took the envelope. My great-uncle wasn't unstable, Nora said quietly. I know that's what people around here were told. He was a careful man in a situation that stopped being safe. She looked at the hatch still open behind May. Whatever is in that envelope, he thought it was important enough to protect for as long as it took for the right person to find it. May turned the envelope in her hands. The wax seal on the back was stamped with a simple V barely visible in the faded red wax. She looked back up at Nora Voss. "Come inside," she said. The envelope sat on the metal table between them. May had poured coffee from the small camp stove, and Nora Voss held her cup in both hands, the way people held warm things when they were cold from the inside rather than the outside. Diesel had assessed Nora in the first 2 minutes, circled once, and then settled near the generator, with his chin on his paws, watching with the relaxed vigilance of a dog who had decided someone was not a threat but had not quite decided they were a friend. May looked at the envelope. She had held unexploded devices before, casings with unknown contents, objects that looked like one thing and were another. She had learned to read the weight of something before she opened it, to understand what she was dealing with before she changed its state. Once you opened something, you could not unopen it. The world after was always different from the world before. She picked up the envelope and broke the seal. The paper inside was folded in thirds. The creases still sharp, despite the decades, the kind of fold made by someone who took care with small things because they understood that small things were where character lived. The handwriting was the same type precise script as the notebook, but calmer. Edgar Voss writing not in the compressed urgency of a man documenting things in secret, but in the deliberate voice of a man who had decided what he needed to say and was saying it once carefully for keeps. May read it aloud slowly so that Nora could hear it too. It seemed right that she should. "If you are reading this," Edgar had written, "then I am gone from that place and you are in it, and whatever I built there has finally passed to someone I did not know and could not choose. That is as it should be. The things I am going to tell you are not comfortable things, but they are true, and I have spent 2 years understanding that truth kept silent is not really kept at all. It only waits." He described the program without naming it. A group of 7 men, senior figures in defense procurement and federal finance, had used the infrastructure of Cold War preparedness as a vehicle. They had moved money through classified budget lines, money drawn from defense appropriations, from emergency preparedness funds, from accounts that existed below the level of congressional oversight. They had converted a portion of that money to gold, and they had distributed it across several sites built under the cover of legitimate national security construction. The bunker beneath this property was one of those sites. Edgar had been the engineer on 3 of them. He had understood at first that he was building legitimate Cold War infrastructure. By the time he understood what he was actually building, he was in deep enough that the men above him felt comfortable telling him the truth, which was itself a kind of threat. Men did not tell you the truth about their crimes unless they were confident you could not use it. He had tried to find a way to use it. "I made copies of everything I could access," he wrote. "Authorizations, transfer records, correspondence, names. The names are the important part. 7 men, all of them in positions of enough authority that any accusation without documentation would have been dismissed and the accuser discredited. I have placed those documents in a sealed container within the lower vault. They will still be there when you find this because the lower vault was built to outlast everything around it, including me. I tried to take what I had to the right people. I made 3 attempts over 18 months. Each time I was turned back. Once with a warning I took seriously. I understood then that the right people in this case were not the people I had access to, and that waiting for access might take longer than I had. So I waited a different way. I am giving this to my lawyer with instructions to pass it forward until it reaches the person who purchases this land. I do not know who that will be or when. I only know that the kind of person who buys an abandoned Cold War bunker for a small amount of money and moves into it alone is not doing so because their life is full of easier options. They are doing so because they need somewhere solid to stand. And a person who needs somewhere solid to stand will understand better than most why it matters that the ground beneath them tells the truth. Whatever you do with what you find here, do it slowly. Do not trust the first official face that appears. The men I knew are old now or gone, but the structures they built around themselves have a way of outlasting the people who built them. Their children know. Some of their children's children know. The last line was brief, a single sentence, the handwriting slightly smaller, as if Edgar had pressed down harder on the pen for the final word. She served too. They forgot her name. Don't let them forget yours. The room was quiet when May finished reading. Nora was looking at the table. Her jaw was set. Her eyes were bright but dry, the brightness of someone who had been told something they already knew in their bones and were now hearing confirmed in a dead man's voice. He knew they'd silence him, she said. He just made sure the silence had an expiration date. May set the letter down carefully. She thought about a man who had built this chamber with his own technical knowledge, who had sealed evidence into it, who had walked away in 1965 into a Wyoming winter and never come back. She thought about what it took to do that, to trust a chain of lawyers and time and the eventual appearance of a stranger. She thought about Tommy Riggs handing her his dog tag with a grin. Hold on to this for me. She reached into her jacket and touched the dog tag without taking it out. We need to go back into the vault, she said. The sealed container sat behind the last row of crates along the east wall, exactly where the letter indicated. May had to move 6 crates to reach it, working methodically with Nora's help. The container itself was a military-issue document, safe steel about the size of a large briefcase, its combination lock set to the same date as the vault door, July 18th, 1963. Inside, preserved by the vault's dry, sealed air, were the documents Edgar had described. Originals and certified copies, both organized in labeled folders, with the precision of a man who had known these papers would need to speak clearly long after he was gone. Transfer authorizations on federal letterhead. Budget line items with handwritten annotations cross-referencing the gold shipments. Correspondence, 7 sets of it, each tied with a different color ribbon, 1 color per man. 7 men. 7 sets of paper that connected names to actions in terms that did not require interpretation. And beneath the last folder, tucked flat against the bottom of the safe, a smaller envelope. Not sealed, just folded closed. On the front, in Edgar's handwriting, for the one who finds this. May opened it carefully. Inside was a photograph. Black and white, the size of a standard ID photo, but printed on heavier stock. A woman in a military uniform standing alone in front of a base entrance gate, her posture straight and her expression composed in the way of someone being photographed in an official capacity who would have preferred not to be. She was young, early 20s at most. The uniform bore the insignia of the Women's Army Corps. On the back, in Edgar's tight handwriting, Eleanor Voss, WAC, served 1959 to 1962, discharged without record or reason given. She reported what she saw. They took her service away for it. May held the photograph for a long moment. Nora beside her made a sound that was very quiet and very controlled. My great-aunt Nora said after a moment, "We knew she'd served. We never knew why she wouldn't talk about it." She paused. She died in 1987. Never told anyone. May looked at the photograph, at the young woman's face, at the straight posture of someone who had shown up and done the work and been erased for the trouble. She folded the photograph carefully and held it. She served too, she said quietly. Edgar's last line in the letter, not just a closing sentiment, a specific woman, a specific injustice. He had been carrying her story along with the documents because he understood that the documents were the evidence, but Eleanor was the reason. May laid out all the documents on the floor of the vault in the beam of her flashlight and read each one. It took 40 minutes. Nora sat against the wall and said nothing. When May finished, she sat back on her heels and looked at the spread of papers. "These are 60-year-old documents," she said. "The men who signed them are dead or near it." Nora looked at her steadily. "Their estates aren't. Their foundations aren't. The institutions they built with this money aren't." May nodded slowly. She thought about what Edgar had written. The structures they built around themselves have a way of outlasting the people who built them. She thought about Marcus Holt, a man who had been circling this property for at least 2 years, with the patience of someone who knew exactly what was here. The business card prepared in advance. The company his men carried in their pockets, Voss Recovery, LLC. The same name, the same family. The grandson of one of the 7 men here to reclaim what his grandfather had buried and call it inheritance. She began repacking the documents with care. "We're going to need help with this," she said. "The right kind." She looked at Nora. "Do you trust Brody?" Nora considered that for a moment. "He was honest with my family when he didn't have to be. When I was trying to find out what happened to Edgar years ago, he pulled the old files and actually read them." She paused. "Yes, I think so," May nodded. "Then let's go up." She called Brody at 6 in the morning. He arrived at 7 alone in his personal truck rather than the cruiser. That distinction mattered, and May noted it. She showed him the letter first, then the documents from the safe laid out on the metal table in the bunker's main chamber, the generator running clean, and the overhead lights steady. Brody read everything without speaking, taking his time, the way a man took time with things he understood were not reversible once acted upon. When he finished, he straightened and looked at May. "You know what you're sitting on," he said. She nodded. "And you know who came to see you?" "Holt, yes." Brody was quiet for a moment. He looked at the documents, then at the hatch above them, then back at May. He rubbed the back of his neck. "I know someone in the Denver field office," he said, "FBI. We served together before he went federal. He's the kind of man who read the same oath I did and meant it." He paused. "If I reach out to him directly, not through channels, not with paperwork that creates a trail before we're ready for a trail, he can be here quietly. Let him see what you've got. Then we decide together how it goes official." May thought about Edgar's warning. Do not trust the first official face that appears. Brody was not the first official face. He was the second, and he had come in his personal truck and read 60-year-old documents with the respect they deserved. "Do it," she said. Marcus Holt came back on the 3rd day. This time he did not knock. He was at the hatch when May came up already talking, before she cleared the opening. His voice carrying the tone of a conversation he had decided they were going to have, regardless of her preferences. "Ms. Raines," he said, "I think we've arrived at the point where being indirect stops serving either of us." He was still in the black coat, still in polished, cool shoes, but something in his posture had shifted. The composed ease of the first visit was still present, but underneath it, close enough to the surface to be visible, if you knew how to look, was pressure. The pressure of a man who had been waiting longer than he had planned to wait. Diesel had come up beside May and was standing at her left, his body angled forward, his gaze fixed on Holt with the focus of a dog who had formed his opinion and was waiting for the situation to confirm it. "You found the vault," Holt said. "I know you did. A woman who bought a bunker to sleep through the winter doesn't need to visit her generator room 3 times in 4 days." May said nothing. He spread his hands slightly, an open gesture designed to communicate reasonableness. "I'm not here to take anything from you. What I'm proposing is straightforward. The gold in that vault has no clear legal owner. The federal government has no documented claim that would survive scrutiny because documenting it would require explaining how it got there. You have a legitimate land claim but no provenance on the contents." His eyes were steady and entirely focused. "I have the resources to make this disappear quietly and compensate you generously. You walk away with enough to build something real. No investigations, no lawyers, no years of your life spent in federal processes that may or may not resolve in your favor." He paused. Or he said more quietly, "You choose the complicated version." May reached into her jacket pocket and brought out the photograph of Eleanor Voss. She held it up so Holt could see it clearly. His expression changed. It was small and fast and controlled, but it was there. A fraction of a second's recalibration. the recognition of a man confronting something he had not expected to exist. He recovered smoothly. But the recovery itself was the tell. Your great-grandfather, May said, he wasn't just one of the men who built this. He was the one who covered up what happened to Edgar's sister after she reported what she'd seen in the program she was assigned to. Eleanor Voss, Women's Army Corps, discharged without record in 1962. Her service erased because she knew too much and didn't stay quiet about it. She lowered the photograph. You didn't come here for historical recovery, she said. You came here because this is your family's exposure, not just the gold. The paper trail Edgar left connects your great-grandfather's name to enough to posthumously destroy everything built on top of it. The foundations, the endowments, the reputation. She heard a vehicle on the track before Holt responded. He heard it too. His eyes moved to the tree line and then back to her, and in that movement she saw the rapid recalculation of a man who understood that the timing of the arrival was not coincidence. Brody's truck came into the clearing. Behind it, a dark blue sedan with federal plates. A man in his early 50s in a gray jacket got out of the passenger side with the unhurried purposefulness of someone who had driven 4 hours in the early morning and had been thinking the whole way about how the next hour was going to go. Brody walked to May's side and stood there without speaking. The man from the sedan crossed the clearing and stopped at a professional distance. He looked at Holt first, then at May, then at the open hatch. Ms. Raines, he said, I'm Agent Douglas Farr, FBI Denver. Sheriff Brody reached out to me directly. I've had a preliminary look at the documentation you have located, and I'd like to talk with you in detail about next steps. He looked at Holt once more, the look of a man who had reached a complete conclusion. Mr. Holt, he said, you've been on our radar for 14 months in connection with the Voss Recovery LLC inquiry. Your presence here today is going to simplify several things considerably. He nodded to a second agent who had come around from the driver's side of the sedan. I'd appreciate it if you'd come with us. Holt looked at May, his composure held, but his eyes for just a moment carried something that was not anger and not defeat, something more like recognition. The look of a man who had spent years maneuvering around a thing and had finally arrived at the place where the maneuvering ended. He went without resistance. May watched them put him in the sedan and close the door. She stood in the cold morning air with the photograph of Eleanor Voss still in her hand and watched Farr walk back toward her with a notepad and the expression of a man who had a great many questions and understood that the answers mattered. The process that followed was neither fast nor simple. Farr spent 3 days on the property working through the vault's contents with the methodical care of someone who understood that the chain of custody for 60-year-old evidence had to be built as carefully as the evidence itself. May walked him through everything: the notebook, the letter, the documents, the photograph. She answered every question twice, once for the record and once for his understanding, and she did not rush any of it. On the second May, Farr looked at Eleanor's photograph for a long time. Then he said quietly that there were other women in the records they had been assembling from related sites, women who had served in administrative capacities during the early Cold War period and had been discharged or silenced when they came too close to things they weren't supposed to see. He said the documentation from this site might be the most complete record they had found, connecting specific names to specific consequences. May held the photograph. She served, May said. They forgot her name. Farr looked at her. We're not going to forget it, he said. Not this time. She placed the photograph carefully in the evidence folder. The government's compensation came 6 weeks later. A formal letter, legal language, an attached check representing the assessed value of the property contents as historical evidence of federal significance. It was not the value of the gold, but it was real and it was clean and it was enough. Inside the envelope with the check was a second smaller envelope, plain white, no official letterhead. May opened it at the table with Diesel at her feet. Inside was a single index card, handwritten in the careful block print of someone who had thought about what they wanted to say before they wrote it. Ms. Raines. My aunt served in the Women's Army Corps from 1960 to 1963. She was discharged without explanation. She never talked about her service, and we never understood why. I've spent 30 years in federal law enforcement, and I never had the documentation to ask the right questions. Because of what you found and what you chose to do with it, I do now. Her name was Patricia Ann Farr. Thank you for not letting Eleanor Voss stay buried. It means the women like her didn't serve in silence for nothing. It was signed Douglas Farr, Special Agent, FBI, Denver. May read it twice. Then she set it flat on the table and sat with it for a long time. She thought about Eleanor Voss standing straight in front of a gate in 1962, being photographed for a record that would be erased. She thought about Patricia Ann Farr, whoever she was carrying, something she couldn't explain for the rest of her life. She thought about Edgar walking into a Wyoming winter with a chain of trust he had no way of knowing would hold. She thought about a classifieds listing, $900, sold as is. She had bought a place to disappear. What she had found was a reason to stay visible. Brody came by the day after the compensation letter arrived. He sat at the metal table, now sanded and refinished, and drank coffee that was considerably better than what she'd served him the first time. "You did good," he said. May turned the check over in her hands. She had been looking at it for an hour, not at the amount, but at what the amount made possible. "I want to use it for this place," she said. "Fix it up properly. Make it a real space." Brody looked around the chamber. The concrete walls cleaner now, the shelves organized, the generator running reliably. A small wood stove Nora had helped her install against the east wall, its pipe running up through the ceiling. Diesel's bed near the vent where afternoon light came through. "For who?" Brody asked. May looked at him. "For people who need somewhere solid to stand. Veterans. People who've been in situations where the world stops making sense and they need somewhere quiet to start making sense of it again." Brody was quiet for a moment. Then he nodded once slowly, with the nod of a man who had seen enough of the world to know that the things it needed most were usually the simplest ones to name and the hardest ones to build. "I know people," he said. "I can help with that." Nora handled the paperwork with the brisk competence of someone who found satisfaction in forms done correctly. The nonprofit designation came through in 8 weeks. Garrett Lowe arrived on a Tuesday in late March, the first snow already melting off the pines. He was 40, lean and quiet, with burn scars along his jawline from something he had been through in a place he didn't name. He'd heard about the shelter through Brody, through a Veterans Services coordinator in Casper, through word passed between people who understood what it was to need somewhere and not know how to ask. He stood at the edge of the clearing with a single pack over his shoulder and looked at the place with the careful assessment of a person who had been disappointed by several things in recent years and had learned not to spend hope before they had to. May came up through the hatch and stood in the clearing and looked at him. He looked back. Diesel walked between them, sniffed Garrett's boots, thoroughly circled once, and sat at May's feet, facing him with his tail making one slow arc in the cold air. "Come on down," she said. "Coffee's on." Garrett followed her to the hatch and climbed down into the warm amber light of the bunker, and May came down behind him and pulled the hatch closed against the cold. The generator hummed, the wood stove ticked. The smell of coffee moved through the air like something trying to remind you of home. On the first evening that felt like spring, May built a fire in the small pit she and Nora had dug beside the hatch, ringed with flat stones from the creek at the property's edge. Brody came. Nora came. Garrett brought a man he'd met in Casper, a veteran named Pierce, who was quiet in the way of someone who had recently decided to try being somewhere instead of nowhere. The fire was small and steady, the pine wood catching clean. May sat on a flat boulder at the fire's edge with Diesel's head in her lap and looked up at the Wyoming sky. Out here, past the reach of any town's light, the stars were not scattered, but poured thick and white across the dark from horizon to horizon. May had not looked at a sky like this in a long time, without the overlay of something else, the background noise of a nervous system that had been running on threat assessment for 2 decades. Tonight, the sky was just the sky. She reached into her jacket and took out Tommy's dog tag. She held it for a moment, the metal warm from her body, the edges familiar in the dark. She thought about Tommy's grin, about the faith in the gesture. Hold on to this for me. She had held it through everything. She turned it over once in her fingers, then she set it down gently on the flat stone beside her in the ring of firelight where she could see it clearly. Not letting go, just setting it down. There was a difference, and the difference was everything. Nora sat down on the stone beside her and looked at the train tag without asking about it. After a moment, she said quietly, "He'd have liked this. Edgar. He was always better with people than with the official version of things." May looked at the fire. "He trusted the long way around," she said. Nora nodded. "Sometimes that's the only way that gets there." Across the fire, Garrett was talking to Pierce in low tones, the conversation of two people finding the edges of a shared language. Brody was looking at the sky with the expression of a man genuinely at rest, which May suspected was not his default state, but which he was practicing. Nora had her hands around her cup and her eyes on the fire, and she was smiling in the small, private way of someone who has put down something heavy and is only now noticing how long they'd been carrying it. Diesel shifted in May's lap, exhaled deeply, and closed his eyes. She put her hand on him, the familiar weight and warmth. She thought about Eleanor Voss in an FBI evidence folder in Denver. Her name now part of an official record that would not be quietly filed away. She thought about Patricia Farr, whose nephew had spent 30 years asking the wrong questions because the right documentation didn't exist until now. She thought about Edgar walking out into a Wyoming winter with the faith of a man who had done what he could with what he had and trusted the rest to time. She looked at Tommy's dog tag on the stone. The firelight moved across the worn metal, finding the letters, making them briefly bright. She had bought this land with the last money she had because she needed somewhere to stop running. She had found something she hadn't known she was looking for. Not treasure, not answers, not even peace exactly. Just the particular quiet of a place that had been waiting for someone who understood that some things were worth protecting, that some stories were worth finishing, and that the ground you stood on mattered most when you finally chose to stand still. The fire crackled low. The stars held their positions. The Wyoming hills were dark and close around them, and the bunker beneath their feet held nothing now but warmth and the sound of people breathing. Diesel's ear twitched once in a dream. May left her hand on him and did not move. She had stopped running. That was enough.